The glass in Jimin's hand trembled just once before he laughed. Too loud, too bright, too perfect. And across the crowded room, Jungkook knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. Jimin stood beneath the warm spill of chandelier light, dressed in black silk that caught gold at every angle, his smile radiant enough to fool everyone in the room. The party moved around him in glittering waves, soft jazz, expensive perfume, crystal clinking against crystal, polite laughter stitched into the air like something rehearsed. Cameras flashed. Someone called Jimin's name and he turned with practiced ease, lifting his chin, letting that dazzling smile settle over his face like armor. To everyone else, Park Jimin looked untouchable. To Jungkook, he looked like a man drowning in plain sight. He had noticed it first in the way Jimin laughed half a second too late, then in the way his fingers tightened around the stem of his glass until his knuckles blanched pale beneath the amber light, then in the way his shoulders locked every time someone brushed too close. Tiny fractures in a flawless performance, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. Jungkook knew where to look. He stood at the edge of the ballroom, one hand curled around a champagne flute he hadn't touched, his dark suit immaculate, his expression unreadable to everyone except the one person who kept avoiding his eyes. The room was loud, but all he could hear was the sharp, uneven rhythm of Jimin's breathing from across the floor, as if his body were speaking in a language only Jungkook remembered. Something had happened. Jimin laughed again, softer this time, at something one of the executives said. He tilted his head, elegant and charming, every movement precise enough to look effortless. But Jungkook saw the crack in it, the slight tremor in his lower lip just before he smiled, the tension in his jaw, the way his gaze kept flicking toward the exit and then away again. Jungkook set his untouched glass down. He crossed the room. He ignored the greetings thrown in his direction, the hands reaching for his shoulder, the polite attempts to stop him. He moved through the crowd with quiet purpose, eyes fixed only on Jimin. The closer he got, the stronger the unease sharpened inside him. Jimin's cologne reached him first, clean, soft, familiar beneath the heavier scent of expensive liquor and polished wood. Then came the sight of him up close, beautiful and composed and wrong in a way that made Jungkook's chest tighten. Jimin looked at him then, just for a second, and in that single second the smile disappeared, not fully. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But Jungkook saw it, the exhaustion beneath the charm, the fear buried under polish, the silent plea in eyes too steady to be calm. Then Jimin smiled again. It was dazzling, effortless, entirely fake. "Jungkook," Jimin said, his voice smooth as silk, warm enough to fool the others standing around them. "You're late," was laughter, easy, social, oblivious. Jungkook kept his eyes on Jimin's face. "You're lying." The words landed quietly, but Jimin's fingers slipped against the glass. Only once, only enough. The others laughed again, mistaking it for flirtation, for wit, for the familiar edge of something playful between them. Someone made a joke. Someone else turned away. The music swelled and the moment folded neatly back into the performance, but Jimin's gaze hardened for just a fraction of a second. A warning, not here. Jungkook understood immediately. That was the problem. He always understood Jimin too quickly. He stepped back first, letting the moment dissolve, letting the room breathe again. Jimin smiled at someone to his left. Jungkook nodded at someone he didn't hear. Around them the party resumed its glossy rhythm, unaware that something had cracked open beneath its glittering surface. Still, Jungkook did not take his eyes off Jimin, not when Jimin laughed again. Not when he charmed investors with elegant ease. Not when he slipped through conversations like water, all grace and control and carefully measured distance. And not when Jimin vanished. It happened so smoothly no one else noticed. One moment he was there, smiling under gold light with a hand on someone's arm. The next he was gone, no farewell, no excuse, no visible break in the rhythm of the evening. A magician's trick, a practiced escape, but Jungkook noticed, of course he did, he followed without thinking. Out past the ballroom, beyond the velvet hush of the hotel corridor, past framed mirrors and soft carpet and the muted elegance of wealth. The music dimmed behind him. The air changed, cooler, quieter, the kind of silence that pressed against the skin. He found Jimin in the service stairwell. The door had barely shut before Jungkook heard it. The sharp inhale, the crack in composure, the sound of someone trying and failing to breathe evenly. Jimin stood with one hand braced against the concrete wall, the other pressed hard over his mouth. His shoulders trembled once, then again. His reflection was gone now, stripped from polished glass and chandelier light. No silk, no charm, no performance, just a man in the harsh fluorescence of a stairwell trying not to fall apart where no one could see. Jungkook stopped at the door. For one suspended second, neither of them moved. Then Jimin laughed. It was small. Broken. Nothing like the one he had worn upstairs. Jimin dragged a hand through his hair and let out another breathless laugh, eyes fixed on the floor. You always know. Jungkook closed the door behind him. The sound echoed through the stairwell like something final. Jimin looked wrecked up close. Beautiful still because he always was, but frayed at the edges in a way that made beauty feel irrelevant. His eyeliner had smudged faintly beneath one eye. His breath came too fast. His hand was still shaking. Jungkook stepped closer. What happened? Jimin gave him a smile so tired it barely counted. Nothing. Jungkook's jaw tightened. Don't do that. Do what? Lie to me with that face. For a moment something sharp flashed across Jimin's expression. Anger, hurt, maybe both, then he looked away. Jungkook hated that more than he knew how to name. The silence between them thickened, dense with everything unsaid and too familiar. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the space above them. Somewhere far below, a door opened and shut. The world kept moving. Here time stalled. Jimin exhaled slowly, leaning back against the wall like standing had become effort. He was there. Jungkook stilled. He didn't need to ask who. A cold weight dropped into his stomach. Jimin gave a humorless smile, eyes still on the floor. I didn't know he'd be invited. Air changed instantly. Jungkook felt it in the way Jimin's voice flattened, in the way his fingers curled inward, in the sudden stillness that overtook him like the body remembering fear before the mind could stop it. Memory flickered sharp and ugly in Jungkook's chest. Late nights, unanswered calls. The way Jimin had once flinched when someone touched his wrist too suddenly and refused to explain why. Jungkook had spent months respecting silences Jimin had never asked him to fill. Now he wished he had broken every single one. Did he touch you? Jungkook asked, too quietly. Jimin said nothing. That was answer enough. Something dark and immediate moved through Jungkook, so fast it almost felt like instinct. Rage, cold and clean. The kind that sharpened the world into dangerous clarity. Jimin saw it happen. His hand shot out and caught Jungkook's wrist before he could turn toward the door. The contact was brief, but it burned. Jimin said. Jungkook looked down at Jimin's hand around his wrist, then back at his face. He touched you. Jimin's fingers tightened once. Don't make this worse. Jungkook laughed then, once low and disbelieving. Worse. Jimin's expression cracked, not into tears, not yet, but into something rawer, something more frightening. You think I can survive tonight if you lose control? The words hit harder than they should have. Jungkook went still, because that was the truth beneath everything, wasn't it? Jimin was not afraid of the man upstairs. He was afraid of what surviving him had turned into. Jungkook looked at him, really looked, and saw it all at once. The polished smile, the perfect laughter, the elegant performance stretched over old damage and fresh fear. Jimin had not been trying to impress anyone tonight. He had been trying to endure. The realization hollowed Jungkook out. Slowly, carefully, he turned his wrist and caught Jimin's hand instead. Not tight, not possessive, just enough to say, I'm here. Jimin's breath caught. For the first time that night, he looked at Jungkook like he was tired of pretending, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper. I didn't know how to leave without making everyone see me break. Jungkook did not answer right away. He stood there with Jimin's hand in his, the fluorescent light flattening every shadow between them, and felt something inside him shift into a quieter kind of devastation. Not the violent kind that had surged through him a moment ago, not the sharp, blinding anger that made his blood run cold. This was worse. This was the ache of seeing someone you loved standing in the wreckage of themselves and realizing how long they had been bleeding in silence. Jimin tried to pull his hand away first. It was instinctive, small, automatic. Jungkook tightened his fingers just enough to stop him, not enough to trap, just enough to ask him not to disappear again. Jimin looked down at their hands, then let out a breath so shaky it sounded like it hurt on the way out. His shoulders lowered by a fraction, some invisible thread in him loosening under the simple weight of being held. You should go back upstairs, Jimin murmured, though there was no force in it. If people notice you're gone too long, they'll talk. Jungkook's voice came low and steady. Let them. A bitter smile touched Jimin's mouth. You say that because they never talk about you the way they talk about me. Jungkook went still. There it was, not just fear, not just the old wound of whatever had happened upstairs. Something older sat beneath it, deeper and meaner, carved into Jimin by years of scrutiny sharp enough to flay skin. Jimin had always moved through attention like someone walking barefoot over broken glass, graceful enough to make it look effortless, careful enough not to bleed where anyone could see. Jungkook had known that. He had not understood how much it had cost him. Jimin leaned back against the concrete wall and laughed again, but this time there was no performance in it, only exhaustion. Do you know what the cruelest part is? Jungkook waited. Jimin's gaze stayed fixed somewhere over his shoulder, unfocused. I smiled at him before I even realized who he was. The words fell into the space between them like something shattered. Jungkook felt his jaw lock. Jimin swallowed hard. He touched my arm and I smiled because that's what I do, right? His voice turned thin around the edges. I make people comfortable. I make things easy. I make ugly things look harmless. Hands slipped from Jungkook's grip then, not to leave but to cover his own mouth as if he could physically stop the next words from coming out. But they came anyway. I smiled before my body remembered to be afraid. Jungkook had been angry before, now he felt sick. Not because he didn't understand, because he did. He understood the violence of that kind of memory. The body's betrayal. The horror of instinct shaped by survival so deeply it became reflex. He understood what it meant to perform normalcy while panic climbed your spine. He understood what it meant to smile because the alternative was letting people see you fracture in real time. Jimin dragged a hand down his face, smearing what little remained of his composure. And then I saw you watching me. Jungkook frowned. Jimin gave him a look so unguarded it nearly undid him. And I hated that you knew. The confession struck deeper than accusation. Jungkook inhaled once, slow and careful. Why? Jimin laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. Because you always look at me like I'm something worth saving. Stared at him. The stairwell seemed to narrow around them, the hum of electricity overhead suddenly too loud, too close. Jimin's face was pale beneath the hard white light, every fracture visible now that he had stopped trying to hide them. Jungkook had spent years learning Jimin in fragments. The way he stirred his coffee too long when he was anxious, even after the sugar had dissolved. The way he slept with one hand tucked beneath his cheek when exhaustion finally won. The way he laughed louder when he was unhappy. The way silence settled over him like a second skin when something hurt too much to name. Jungkook had learned all of it and still somehow missed the scale of this. His voice was quieter when he spoke. You are. Jimin's eyes flicked to his, something raw moved there, not disbelief. Worse, recognition. Jimin looked away first. That's the problem, he whispered. Jungkook felt those words land somewhere dangerously soft in him. He took one step closer, then another, not enough to corner, not enough to force, just enough that Jimin would have to look at him again. When he did, Jungkook held his gaze and let him see everything he usually kept buried under restraint. I don't care who saw you smile at him. Jimin's breath caught. I don't care if you froze. Jungkook's voice sharpened with something fierce and quiet. I don't care if you laughed, I don't care if you were polite. None of that changes what he did. Jimin said nothing, but something in his face shifted. Jungkook kept going. You surviving it wrong does not make it your fault. Silence that followed was so complete it rang. Jimin stared at him as if Jungkook had said something in a language he had forgotten he knew. Then all at once his expression broke. Not dramatically, not beautifully, nothing cinematic or graceful, it was smaller than that, harder to witness. His mouth parted on a breath that never quite became sound. His eyes shuttered then failed. His shoulders caved inward with the force of something finally giving way. It was not the collapse of someone falling apart, it was the collapse of someone too tired to keep holding themselves together. Jungkook moved before Jimin could turn away from it. He caught him gently, instinctively, one hand at his waist, the other bracing the back of his neck as Jimin folded into him with a broken inhale. The contact was clumsy in the way real comfort often was, awkward, immediate, devastatingly human. Jimin made a sound Jungkook had never heard from him before, not crying, not quite, something lower, rougher, the sound of grief stripped of dignity. Jungkook held him through it, no soft reassurances. No empty promises, no demand for composure. Just one hand spread steady against Jimin's back, feeling every fractured breath as it tore through him. Jimin's forehead pressed against Jungkook's shoulder, body rigid with the effort of not unraveling harder than he already was. His fingers twisted in the fabric at Jungkook's side, clutching once, like he hated needing something and needed it anyway. Jungkook closed his eyes. He had imagined holding Jimin 100 different ways over the years. None of them had ever looked like this. When Jimin finally spoke, his voice came muffled and wrecked against Jungkook's shoulder. So tired, 3 words, that was all, but Jungkook had never heard anything sound more like pain. His hand moved once slow across Jimin's back. I know. Let out a laugh so ruined it barely resembled one. No, you don't. Opened his eyes. He looked down at the man in his arms, the sharp edges of him, the unbearable fragility of him, the exhaustion pressed into every line of his body, and knew Jimin was right, not fully, not yet. But he wanted to more than he had ever wanted anything, so he said the only honest thing he had, then tell me. Jimin went still, the words settled between them, quiet and impossible. Jungkook felt the hesitation move through him like a pulse. Fear, habit. The old instinct to bury and deflect and survive by silence. He felt Jimin wrestle with it in the tense line of his spine, in the hand still fisted in Jungkook's jacket, in the breath he took and held, and did not know how to release. When Jimin finally lifted his head, his face was too close, close enough for Jungkook to see the wet shine in his eyes, close enough to see how carefully he had learned to hide every bruise no one could photograph, close enough to realize that Jimin looked at him the way people looked at open doors when they had forgotten what safety felt like, and when Jimin spoke, his voice was barely more than air. "If I tell you," he whispered, "you'll never look at me the same."
Jungkook did not let go. His hand remained steady at Jimin's waist, the other still warm at the back of his neck, holding him in that narrow space between collapse and confession. The stairwell hummed around them, fluorescent light buzzing overhead, distant footsteps muffled somewhere below, but the world had narrowed to the breath between them and the unbearable quiet in Jimin's eyes. Jungkook looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, with a softness that felt more dangerous than anger, "You don't get to decide that for me." Jimin's breath caught. It was not the answer he had expected. Jungkook could see that in the minute shift of his expression, the way surprise cracked through his exhaustion and left something more fragile exposed beneath it. Jimin had expected pity, or silence, or the careful, awful gentleness people used when they were already stepping away. Instead, Jungkook was still here, still looking at him, still holding him, still refusing to move. Jimin's laugh came out thin and unsteady. "You say that now." Jungkook's gaze did not waver. "I'm saying it now because you need to hear it before you decide what I'm capable of." Something flickered in Jimin's face then, hurt, sharp, and immediate, not because Jungkook was wrong, but because he was not. Jimin had already made the decision for him, already built the ending in his head, already prepared for disgust, distance, disappointment. It was easier that way. Easier to brace for loss than risk wanting mercy and not surviving the absence of it. Jungkook saw all of it happen in real time. He had seen Jimin perform for rooms full of strangers. He had seen him charm critics, seduce cameras, disarm hostility with elegance so effortless it looked like instinct. But this was different. This was Jimin stripped of every defense except the one he had built deepest into bone. Leave first, even if only in your mind. Jungkook hated how practiced it looked. Jimin stepped back then, just enough to break the full weight of the contact between them. Jungkook let him. His hands fell away slowly, not retreating so much as making room. Jimin leaned against the wall again, shoulders tense, one hand dragging over his face like he could wipe the vulnerability off. He looked tired in a way sleep would never fix. When he finally spoke, his voice was level, but only because he was forcing it there. "He was older than me." Jungkook went very still. Jimin stared at the opposite wall, jaw tight, eyes distant. Not by much, old enough to know better, young enough that everyone called him charming instead. Air in the stairwell seemed to thin. Jungkook said nothing. Jimin gave a humorless smile. He liked that people trusted him. The words were calm. Too calm. Jungkook knew enough to recognize the violence of that kind of calm. Jimin folded his arms across himself, fingers digging into silk sleeves. He was careful. That was the worst part. His voice stayed flat, precise, like he was reciting someone else's memory because that was the only way to survive speaking it aloud. He never did anything anyone could call cruel if they weren't paying attention. Not at first. Jungkook felt his pulse in his throat. Jimin continued, each word measured with surgical control. He was patient, helpful, protective in public. The kind of person people thanked for taking care of me. Something cold and lethal uncoiled in Jungkook's chest. He understood now why Jimin had smiled. Men like that were never monsters where anyone could see them. They were polished, beloved, safe-looking. That was how they got close enough to ruin things quietly. Jimin swallowed once. He learned what made me easy to corner. Jungkook's hands curled at his sides. Jimin noticed. Of course he did. A tired kind of resignation crossed his face. That look right there is why I didn't tell you. Jungkook forced his hands open. Jimin let out a breath and tilted his head back against the concrete wall, staring at the ceiling as if it were easier than looking at him. "I was younger," he said. "Too eager to be liked, too grateful when people were kind." He figured that out fast. The fluorescent light painted his skin pale, made every strain in his face impossible to hide. He looked both younger and older all at once. Jungkook hated that too. "Never had to force much," Jimin said, and for the first time something in his voice cracked, not loudly but enough. "That's the part people never say out loud." Jungkook stopped breathing for half a second. Jimin laughed once, low and bitter, already hearing the accusation before anyone had spoken it. "I said yes too often. I stayed too long. I kept answering his calls. I kept letting him near me after I knew I hated what happened when he was." Shame in his voice was quiet enough to be mistaken for control. It hit Jungkook harder than anger had. Jimin looked at him then, finally, eyes bright with something that was not quite tears and not quite defiance. Do you understand? Jungkook did, not every detail, not every scar, but enough to know exactly what Jimin was asking. Not did it happen. Not was it bad. Not do you feel sorry for me. He was asking the worst question. Do you still think I deserve gentleness if I did not leave the first time? Jungkook felt something inside him fracture cleanly down the middle. Jimin's mouth curved into a smile so brittle it looked painful. That's usually where people start changing the way they look at me. Jungkook took one step toward him. Jimin went silent. You were manipulated, Jungkook said. Jimin's expression hardened instantly. Don't! You were cornered. Jungkook, you were taught to confuse survival with consent. The words landed like a blow. Jimin flinched, actually flinched, not because Jungkook had raised his voice. Because he hadn't. The truth was quieter than that, and infinitely harder to outrun. Jimin stared at him, breathing gone shallow again, something unsteady breaking open behind his eyes. Jungkook moved closer, close enough now that Jimin had to choose between looking away and listening. His voice dropped. You learned how to make it bearable because you had to. Jimin's lips parted. No sound came out. Jungkook kept his gaze on him, relentless in his tenderness now because he understood suddenly that softness could be as merciless as fury when it refused to let shame keep lying. That is not the same as wanting it. A beat. That is not the same as choosing it. Another. That is not the same as giving it willingly. Jimin's breath left him like something knocked loose. He looked wrecked by the words. Not healed, not comforted, seen. It was almost harder. Jimin turned away sharply, one hand bracing against the wall again, shoulders tight as if his body no longer knew what to do with the weight of being understood correctly. Jungkook let the silence hold. He watched Jimin fight for breath, watched his fingers flex against concrete, watched years of carefully arranged self-blame begin, however violently, to lose shape. When Jimin finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. I hated myself for missing him. Jungkook closed his eyes for one brief second. There it was, the wound beneath the wound, not just what had been done to him, but what trauma had made monstrous afterward. Jimin laughed, raw and miserable. Isn't that disgusting? Jungkook opened his eyes. No. Jimin turned, anger flashing too fast and too bright. Don't lie to make me easier to survive. Jungkook took the hit and held his ground. Not lying. Jimin's chest rose sharply. I missed him after. I missed the version of him that was kind to me. I missed the way he made me feel wanted before he made me feel small. I missed him enough to go back. Word was a blade Jimin had likely spent years sharpening against himself. Jungkook let him throw everyone. And then, quietly, he said, Of course you did. Jimin froze. Jungkook's voice did not soften. It steadied. You missed the part of him that taught you to feel safe before he taught you fear. He took another breath. You missed what he made you need. Another. You missed the person he pretended to be. Stared at him. Jungkook felt the force of that stare like impact, like Jimin was searching his face for the recoil that never came. He found none. What he found instead seemed to undo him more. Jimin's mouth trembled. His eyes shuddered hard, as if against pain too bright to look at directly. When he spoke again, the words were smaller than anything he had said all night. I thought if I told you this, you'd look at me and see something ruined. Stepped into the last of the distance between them. When he answered, his voice was quiet enough to hurt. I'm looking at you now. Jimin stopped breathing for a second, not literally. Not enough to collapse, but enough for Jungkook to see the exact moment the words struck somewhere deep and unguarded, somewhere Jimin had spent years walling off so completely he no longer knew what it meant to let anyone near it. The silence that followed was unbearable, not empty, not calm. It was the silence of something old and buried being dragged, trembling, into light. Jimin looked at him as if he had forgotten how. As if being seen without revulsion was a language his body no longer knew how to translate. Jungkook held his gaze and did not move. He did not reach for him again, did not soften the moment with false comfort, did not offer the kind of mercy that asked Jimin to become easier to witness. He only stood there and let him be difficult, let him be messy, let him be human. Jimin's throat worked once, then again. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely there. You should hate me a little. Jungkook frowned. Jimin laughed, but the sound was wrecked before it fully formed. Wouldn't that be easier? The question hit with the force of confession, not because Jimin believed Jungkook should hate him, because some part of him believed hatred would at least make sense. Jungkook saw it all at once. The logic trauma had carved into him, cruel and intimate. If what happened was ugly, then perhaps he must be too. If he had stayed, if he had returned, if he had missed what hurt him, then maybe disgust was the only reasonable response. Maybe punishment was simpler than tenderness. Maybe hatred, at least, would feel familiar. Jungkook hated that this was what had been left in him. He said. Jimin's expression tightened, almost angry now. You say that like it's simple. It isn't simple. Then stop making it sound like it is. Jungkook's jaw tightened. I'm not making it simple, I'm making it clear. Something sharp flashed across Jimin's face. Good, let him be angry. Anger meant he was still here. Jungkook took a slow breath and let it out carefully. You want me to hate the parts of you that survived badly because that would be easier than asking me to understand them. Went still. Jungkook did not look away. You think if I hate those parts first, then at least it'll be on your terms. Jimin's lips parted. No sound came out. The truth had landed too close. Jungkook saw it in the way his shoulders locked, in the sudden stillness that overtook him whenever something struck too precisely to deny. Jimin's eyes sharpened with something raw and defensive. You don't get to say that like you know me. Jungkook almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it hurt. The words came out quieter than he meant them to. Jimin flinched at that too. Jungkook looked at him, really looked, and felt years pressing against the inside of his ribs, too heavy now to keep carrying in silence. I know how you smile when you're trying not to shake. His voice stayed low, even devastating in its steadiness. I know you apologize when other people hurt you. A breath. I know you laugh louder when you're miserable because silence makes people ask questions. Another. I know you disappear before anyone can notice you're drowning. His jaw tightened. And I know you have spent years turning your pain into something elegant enough that no one calls it pain at all. Stared at him. All the fight went out of his face at once. Jungkook had not meant to say it. Not like this. Not all of it, but it was too late now. The words hung between them, naked and irreversible. Jimin looked at him with something close to shock, not because Jungkook had seen him, because he had. For this long. In this much detail. And had stayed silent only because he thought being gentle meant waiting to be invited. Jimin swallowed hard. His voice, when it came, was smaller than before. How long? Jungkook knew what he meant. How long have you known? How long have you been watching me unravel and saying nothing? How long have I been visible in ways I never agreed to be? Jungkook answered honestly. Long enough to know when your smiles stop reaching your eyes. Jimin's face changed. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But something in him gave way under the weight of that answer. Years, Jungkook thought. It had taken years for someone to say to Jimin, I noticed, not I suspected. Not I worried. Not I heard, I noticed. Jimin looked down, suddenly unable to hold his gaze. His voice came rough. Then why didn't you say anything? There it was, not accusation. Not entirely, something more fragile than that. If you saw me, why did you leave me alone in? Felt the guilt of it like a bruise he had been carrying too long to remember where it started, because he had seen. Not all of it, but enough to know Jimin was hurting. Enough to know there were shadows behind the polish. Enough to know something had taught him to survive by disappearing in plain sight. And Jungkook had done what he thought was kind. He had waited. He had mistaken restraint for care. Silence for gentleness. Distance for respect. Now, standing in this cold stairwell with Jimin half broken in front of him, it felt a lot like cowardice. Jungkook exhaled slowly. Because I thought being careful with you was the same thing as protecting you. Jimin's eyes lifted to his. Jungkook let him see the regret there, all of it. I thought if I pushed you, run, a pause. So I let you keep your secrets and told myself that was kindness. His mouth tightened. It wasn't. Jimin said nothing. Jungkook laughed once, bitter and quiet. It was fear dressed up as patience. That seemed to hit Jimin harder than anything else had. His expression shifted, not into comfort but recognition. Because he understood that too well, didn't he? The ways fear learned to disguise itself as virtue. The ways people called avoidance mercy when it was easier than risking honesty. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The air between them felt different now. Not lighter. Not healed. Just stripped of something false. Jimin looked exhausted in the aftermath of it, shoulders slumped against concrete, eyes rimmed red, mouth parted slightly like even breathing had become labor. He looked ruined in the least romantic sense of the word. Jungkook had never wanted him more carefully. The thought struck hard enough to make him still, not desire, not hunger, something quieter, more dangerous, the need to hold what was breakable and not make it worse. Jimin's voice cut through the silence, thin with disbelief. You make it sound so easy to stay. Looked at him. He said, I'm making it sound like I already chose to. Jimin's breath caught. Jungkook felt the shift in the room as surely as if the floor had moved under them. There it was, not the confession itself, but the edge of it. The truth they had spent too long circling in quieter forms. Jimin stared at him, all sharp breath and stunned silence. Jungkook's pulse thudded once, hard enough to hurt. He had not meant to say that either, or maybe he had. Maybe he had meant to say it for years. Jimin's voice came barely above a whisper. Jungkook! There was warning in it, and fear, and something infinitely more dangerous than either. Jungkook stepped closer anyway. Close enough now that the space between them felt charged with every unsaid thing they had both spent too long pretending not to carry. Close enough that Jimin's next breath touched his mouth. And suddenly, the silence between them no longer felt empty at all.